I think, Bill, you talked about rhythmic experimentation, and it didn't feel experimental to us. It felt logical and secure, and we weren't conscious of breaking new ground. We just played the way things seemed logical to us.
I had the chance to hang out with Chuck Israels when I was visiting Portland earlier in 2018. I'm Jason Heath. This is Contrabass Conversations, and it's always so cool to me how chatting with someone on the podcast can end up turning into a real-world situation and acquaintance and friendship. And I had such a great time hanging out with Chuck Israels while I was visiting Portland. He and I actually did a road trip together down to Eugene, Oregon, to Seth Kimmel, great luthier, former podcast guest, down to Seth Kimmel's shop. And we were playing some basses. Seth made a bass for Chuck recently. And how cool to spend a day chatting with really one of the legends of not only jazz bass, but jazz in general. And what a brilliant thinker and just a great guy. I had so much fun hanging out with Chuck and also with Colin Corner, the new principal bass of the Oregon Symphony. Colin, Chuck, and I went out and tried out some microphones and had some lunch together. And Colin and I went to a gig of Chuck's even later on. And just how cool. And it got me thinking. I didn't chat with Chuck in Portland for a round two for the podcast. I will do that, but I thought a lot of you probably haven't heard my original conversation with Chuck, and this dates back to, I believe, very early 2016, maybe even the end of 2015, somewhere around there. Chuck was coming out with not one but two album releases. So you will be hearing about those, but also about Chuck's time with Bill Evans, so many of the amazing experiences he's had throughout his career. And he is going strong. He's working on new projects. Chuck thinks of himself actually as a composer primarily and then a bass player. And we dig into that a bit, but definitely got to get Chuck on for round two. So I really hope you enjoyed this conversation from a couple years ago at this point, and this deep dive into the way Chuck thinks about bass. And before we get going, I would like to thank Upton Bass and DAddario Strings for sponsoring the podcast. And here we go with this rebroadcast of my conversation with Chuck Israels. Cool. Yeah, maybe just tell folks, what was your first musical instrument?
The ukulele.
Interesting. So did that lead you into guitar after that?
Yeah, the ukulele was easy. Only
Right.
4 strings and
Right.
pretty simple fingerings, and it led to an interest in chords and harmony.
Yeah, sure.
And then I played the guitar and the cello. In junior high school. I played cello in the junior high school orchestra and continued through high school and with the cello and the guitar. Then when I got to MIT, where I thought I was going to get an electrical engineering degree, I was going to get an EE degree, and I got a Ellington Evans degree.
Oh. Nice.
There were 12 cellists in the orchestra and no bass players, and they had some pretty good sounding basses in the instrument room. And I picked up one and thought, well, there's 12 of those guys, and I don't like. It's not that I didn't like the cello. I love the cello as an instrument, but my particular cello wasn't a good one. Mm-hmm. And the basses were pretty good, so I picked one up and said, well, okay, I'm going to be the one bass player in the orchestra instead of one of the 13th of 12, already 12 cellists. And then running into young people my age who were accomplished players, Steve Kuhn, a very fine pianist, and Arnie Wise, who was a terrific drummer who was at Massachusetts School of the Arts. there was a piano player and a drummer, and they needed a bass player, and that was the beginning of everything.
Wow. So that's when the interest in jazz got kindled. Was that at MIT once you switched over?
A little. Well, no. Before that, my folks were the producers of a concert series in Cleveland when I was 12 years old, and one of those concerts was a Louis Armstrong concert, and that was the beginning of my exposure. And they were classical musicians, but they had Big Spiderbeck records and Louis Armstrong records and Benny Goodman records in the house, so I was not limited in the kind of music I was exposed to.
Oh. And so they were classical musicians. You said, what did they play?
My stepfather was a fine classical singer.
Oh, okay. Obviously, your career, you found yourself in New York City, and maybe just tell folks a little bit about when did you first meet Charlie Mingus? Oh,
I met Charlie Mingus in 1957 when there was a third stream concert. The first of the third stream concerts was produced at Brandeis University, where I was going to school. I had left MIT and gone to Brandeis. Mm-hmm. And they had this group of musicians in June of 1957 who were there to perform 6 pieces of music, 3 written by jazz musicians and 3 written by classical musicians. Mm-hmm. Gunther Schuller was the conductor. And these musicians were on campus for about 10 days. And Brandeis is a campus in a suburban location with no businesses around it, kind of a residential area. Mm-hmm. So when the musicians needed something to eat in breaks during rehearsals, they couldn't go to town conveniently, so they just ate at the student union. Not that the food was particularly good, but it was close and available. Yeah. And I think the food's probably improved since then. But anyway, I was listening to those rehearsals and getting to hear Mingus's piece and to meet Joe Benjamin and Bill Evans and Jimmy Knepper and Art Farmer and Barry Galbraith and all these fine musicians. And at one point, we were playing in the student union when they came in for lunch, and none of them ate lunch. They all sat down and kind of slack-jawed and dumbfounded that there was this professional-level trio in a university setting, because there was, at that time, no jazz in schools, none. So that was when I met Charlie and Bill Evans and George Russell, and Joe Benjamin, all of whom were instrumental in my career a few years later.
All at Brandeis, huh? That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, people know you've done a lot in your career, obviously, but Bill Evans is a name that comes up. And maybe just let folks know a little bit about the circumstances that led you to play in the trio.
Well, it's a story fairly well known, I think. Mm-hmm. Scott LaFaro was my friend, and I became quickly friendly with him for a really short period of time. Just before leaving for Europe on a job that Joe Benjamin had sent me on, and that was a Jerome Robbins Ballet USA tour. That was a long tour. Started in July and went through October and went all over Europe. And I had just gotten to know Scotty. I was there at the Village Vanguard sessions that were recorded on May 30th and 31st of that year. And that was my ideal job, my ideal musical situation, playing with Bill. Mm-hmm. And I was not going to get that job because this fine musician with a close relationship with Bill was in that spot. Shortly after that, it's a kind of a long, complicated story, but shortly after that, I was in Spoleto in Italy and got a letter from a friend telling me that Scotty had died. And at that point, I thought it was likely that Bill would call me. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he didn't play until I got back in October, and there was a telephone call waiting, and I went to work for Bill.
Upton Bass has this amazing new offering in the works. I am so pumped about this bass. Gary put up a video of this travel bass. It is a bass. It is a real bass, but it's in a suitcase, a Samsonite suitcase, a sort of suitcase that you can get at the mall. You got to check this out. Gary takes out of the suitcase these pieces, and in just a few minutes, it's unbelievable, he assembles and starts playing this beautiful acoustic sounding bass, just like what we want, for any sort of gig that we might be doing. This is going to revolutionize bass travel, folks. Check this out and much more at uptonbass.com. You've worked with Bill and all these other jazz luminaries, Coltrane, etc. I'm curious, are there any commonalities just in the way all these people approach their craft that you can maybe, like if you were teaching a lesson to a student and you were trying to just draw some of the commonalities of some of these great artists, like practicing or that kind of thing? Are there anything that these people had in common?
That's an interesting question. I have not thought about it in that way. I'm not sure I can come up with a quick answer.
Sure. Well, yeah, it's kind of a hard question.
Well, because in some ways people think about music. Well, I said Ellington and Evans. Those are two people whose view of music was both deep and broad, mm-hmm. and who were especially important to me. And working with Bill, there was an interest in how all of the music was functioning, not just how your solo went. And that was a critical point of view, a critical element to me. And that's also true of Ellington's music. It's not about how fancy a solo can you play. It's about how much of a story can you tell with everything that's going on with the music from the time it starts till the time the piece ends. Mm-hmm. And there isn't a lot of that going on in music. There's almost none of it going on now.
Yeah.
So those were the things that interested me. I think John Coltrane was interested in some other things, and his point of view happened to line up successfully with the cultural moment that he lived in. He got involved in kind of almost formless ecstasy, and that was very much in line with the whole psychedelic drug culture of the time. Mm-hmm. And I believe it became a big element in his success and in what makes him an icon at the moment. And that perhaps that may change over time. We may look back and say, wait a minute, in the late 50s and early 60s, it was really Sonny Rollins who was making the durable music, the more durable music. Mm-hmm. Anyway, these are just things that, as I think back over what kinds of things I experienced, I don't know what did they have in common. They all loved swinging rhythm. Huh. They all loved, the ones that were interesting to me, all loved musical development. Taking an idea and working with that idea and exploring that idea in many different ways through the composition. And and they were interested in, the ones that were interesting to me were interested in contrasts and in conflict and resolution and balances of elements in the music that kept it interesting to me. And there was nobody better at that than Bill.
The way Bill worked with rhythm is so interesting to me. Just listening, and that must have been fascinating. Just the rhythmic experimentation going on, and the tensions that it created, and that sort of thing.
Well, it wasn't. It was great rhythm. He was perhaps the most rhythmically interesting musician I ever worked with. in jazz. It's his rhythmic vocabulary goes beyond almost anyone else's. I've heard some wonderful Sonny Rollins things that were rhythmically fascinating as well, but Bill was really just far beyond most others. Some of that he got from Lenny Tristano, who was also very interested in that. I think Bill used it in more interesting ways and more natural and less kind of self-conscious ways than Lenny did. But I think he got a lot of his inspiration from Tristano. And you talked about rhythmic experimentation, and it didn't feel experimental to us. It felt logical and secure, and we weren't conscious of breaking new ground. We just played the way things seemed logical to us. A lot of people hear that music and think that there is a kind of a loose relationship with the pulse. But in fact, in order to play that way, you have to have a really deep and tight relationship with the pulse in order to play all those different note values and make them all come out right at the end of the phrase or at the beginning of the next phrase or everywhere in between. I mean, that rhythmic confidence was what made it possible for me to play with Bill, because my harmonic development was far behind my sense of rhythm when I first went to work with Bill. I developed my harmonic language through learning his music.
Oh, interesting, yeah.
But I was strong in the rhythmic area right away. There was really no conflict or not a whole lot for me to catch up with there. I always understood his rhythms and could find complementary things to play with him without stress. And his rhythms, he was such a powerfully independent musician that he was able to play really sensitively and responsively in an ensemble because nothing you did ever threw him for a loop. And he didn't make mistakes. I did from time to time, but it never bothered Bill. And it never threw him off his game. And it was really comforting to play that way.
Yeah. It's interesting about the coming in rhythmically strong and then working on your harmonic language with Bill. You've been involved in jazz education for years. Have you ever had students where it's flipped, their harmonic language is sophisticated, but they just don't have that rhythmic sense?
Sure.
Yeah. What would you do to develop that in people, just with not having that strong rhythm?
Well, I have some things that I try to help people with, and mostly it has to do with understanding your body, because moving your whole body in time and dancing is what gives you good rhythm. Tapping your foot doesn't do a damn thing.
Right.
You have to get up and move. And my strong rhythm probably came from being 12 years old and playing the guitar for square dances when everybody else in my bunk at summer camp had to go to sleep, and I was a big shot. I could stay up with the 14, 15, and 16-year-olds and play for the square dances. And seeing all those people dancing, they can't mess up the time because they're moving a 100 to 150-pound pendulum against gravity, and it's once you get that going at a certain speed, it's pretty hard to alter it.
Uh-huh.
And if you're watching that and playing for it, your time gets solidified. So I think playing for dancers is a part of my musical background that strengthened that element in my musical experience. And I don't think that the institutionalization of jazz education has embraced anything remotely parallel to that in order to establish the same kind of deep commitment to rhythm. Metronomes don't do the same thing. They just tick like clocks, and they don't necessarily. They're a good reference point, but they don't do the same job as dancing does.
Yeah. You've got a post I love. I think it's titled "Unpopular Perspective on Jazz Education," and it's all about basically having role models or having. I think you posed the question like, who is your favorite musician? And all these people that you would run into wouldn't have an answer to that. And it was really interesting. It really got me thinking. Maybe just speak a little about that mentor and imitation and that whole process.
Well, if you were, for example, an aspiring sports guy or a gal, let's imagine you wanted to be a basketball player. If I asked you who your favorite basketball player was, and you told me, I don't know, I like everybody, I watch them all.
Yeah.
It would be a strange response.
Mm-hmm.
If at this, I don't know who all the people are now, LeBron James or before that, Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson, and somebody would be you would say, boy, that guy can really play, and he has these moves and those moves, and oh boy, all I want to do is try to be like that. And that's how you get to be a good basketball player. Well, it's the same thing with anything that you do. You need somebody or bodies to show you how it's done. And many of the students that I have, not all of them, but many of them have just liked the idea of being a jazz musician, of standing up in front of their friends and being creative and being recognized as being creative. And they are taught by the system that you learn to do that by studying the musical equivalent of the alphabet and grammar.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot imagine a poet learning to write poetry by studying the alphabet and grammar. I believe it is necessary to read and understand and love someone's poetry. So my point of view about that is, whose playing are you trying to emulate? It's not, you're not going to make this all up out of whole cloth yourself. No art was ever created that way. All of it comes from what comes before. So you need to absorb what precedes you in order to create your own artistic world. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
And by the way, I suppose if it's rocket science, you better study what went before you in that too.
Right, hopefully.
There are cultures in which people are not falsely encouraged to do their own thing before they've absorbed what that thing might be. If you grow up in Bali and you want to be a Balinese wood carver and do that beautiful carving that they do there, you're a young person and you sit next to people who are a bunch of people who are older and more experienced than you, and you just try to do what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe by the time you're 45 or 50, you say, well, maybe we can do this little thing this way. It's a little better or a little more interesting. But you don't start off being told to create your own musical world, your own artistic world without knowing what the traditions are that preceded you. And since I learned music in school. I learned a lot about traditional classical music in school, but I learned jazz being out playing with people who were better than me,
mm-hmm.
not in a ghetto of 30 students just like me and one experienced guy haranguing me, trying to herd this unruly bunch of cattle into some sense of order. And part of that system is it's efficient. It's good for schools. I'm not so sure it's good for the students.
Yeah.
It's not the worst kind of situation, but it does have its flaws in terms of efficient learning. You really learn efficiently when you're the one guy and there's 30 others that are better than, more experienced than you.
Yeah.
When you're one of the 30, and those are inexperienced people, you tend to influence each other more than that one experienced people can influence any of you. And that's just what that circumstance is like. Yeah. And I did my best to counteract that as a teacher, but the system is pretty hard. The system is a lot bigger than any individual teacher is.
I think you had a line talking about how jazz musicians learn how the jazz musicians perform rather than just the notes and what they're playing. And it's flipping what I think a lot of these people do on its head. And it's an interesting thought.
Well, I work with professional musicians who have a large vocabulary of things to play, and some of them have trouble playing those things as beautifully and as effectively as they might. Mm-hmm. And it's when there's been so much in the educational system that says be new, be creative, be at the top of that part of your game all the time, you tend to pay attention to that, and things slip away, like how well are you playing this stuff? And they're different, there's some people, Charlie Parker, boy, it didn't matter what he played, everything was perfect. Mm-hmm. And it was enormously creative, and every phrase was a gem. There wasn't a note or a nuance that you would change about any of it. And that was an terrifically high standard.
Yeah.
Then there are people like J.J. Johnson who managed to create a language of music in which he didn't ever attempt to play anything on the bandstand that he couldn't control. He made everything sound as if it was specifically written for the trombone. There was never anything unclear about it. It wasn't as wildly inventive as Charlie Parker, mm-hmm. but it was beautiful and always understandable, always told a great story. So there's two different sides of beautiful ways of doing things, both of which were performed to perfection. And I would rather hear a really good performance that doesn't have slipshod elements, or many slipshod elements. I'd like a little risk sometimes. I want to feel that there's risk involved. Otherwise, it's not, if you're not close to the edge, you're taking up too much room. So,
right. Yeah.
There is that sense of risk that makes things exciting. But if, on the other hand, you're slipping over the edge all the time, that's not a lot of fun to observe or listen to either. So mm-hmm. It's all a question of balances of all of these elements. And the system of education in jazz doesn't balance them very well. There's some reasons for that, having to do with how convenient it is to teach them the things that I think are more important. They're not very convenient to teach.
Right.
They happen in real time, and you can't write them down on a piece of paper and take them home and study them. So things get out of whack. Not only that, but we make the error of not looking at the classical music education system that is repertoire-based. You learn repertoire in a certain kind of basic sequence before you start tearing things apart and trying to figure out how they're put together. You just learn to play Vivaldi and Telemann and Corelli, and then move into Handel and then Bach and then Mozart and Schubert and forward through the Romantics and modern people, and that's a useful sequence of learning. Mm-hmm. It follows your capacity to absorb the information. In jazz, we start right away playing something way, way above our heads.
Yeah.
We don't learn when the Saints go marching in. We don't start there. I did, but I don't see that in the system.
Yeah, that's true. You start with like a Maria Schneider tune, maybe when you're in the non. Right. Yeah. Which if I had heard that when I was growing up, I would still be playing Bach and Mozart. That's a good perspective. Yeah, I've never really thought about that sequence that way, but that's true. That's exactly what you do in classical music. You start with the Baroque, move on. Huh.
My jazz education took place that way by accident. Nobody designed it that way, but it did happen in that order. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it makes sense. And then then the next complexity evolves out of what you already know, and that's a very
exactly. It's not just pasted on.
Yeah.
These problems are the educational problems. Then there are other cultural issues that affect what's going on in jazz now and how jazz musicians function in the world, and it's substantially different from how it was when I was growing up, and that difference is not a particularly helpful one.
Yeah. I mean, you've had this perspective over the last many decades on what's been going on. What are you seeing these days for the prospects for younger jazz musicians, people coming up?
Well, I see a few of them hanging on to the essential aesthetic principles that make this music work, but few of them. I see Aaron Deal hanging on to that. Do you know who he is?
No, I'm not familiar.
Aaron Deal is a pianist who is probably best known for being Cecile McLaurin-Salvant's accompanist and arranger.
Okay, sure.
And he's a former Juilliard student who's a intelligent and creative and wonderful musician. And I think another Aaron Goldberg, is also a pretty interesting pianist and is exploring some good things. But what's going on in general is the misunderstanding of what makes a parallel case. It's absolutely essential in learning to understand, to recognize a parallel case when you see one. It's equally important to recognize that a case is not parallel if you see that. And since the music that I grew up playing was a more complicated, more complex, more highly embellished and developed version of popular music, the popular music of that day, young musicians now are looking at that and making the parallel case that therefore they should be playing more complex versions of the popular music of their day. Mm-hmm. The problem is that the popular music of my day was written by educated, phenomenal musicians. George Gershwin, Duke Ellington, Cole Porter, Fats Waller, Harold Arlen, Frank Lesser, Harry Warren. The list goes on forever.
Yeah.
Now who is writing popular music?
Right. It's a different world.
It's a very different world. And it's a different world for socioeconomic reasons.
Yeah.
And those reasons are, I've said this 100 times already, that when the baby boom generation reached adolescence in the mid-'60s, everything changed. And they had money in their pockets, and popular culture became adolescent culture. Mm-hmm. And that's what it is now. And if you're involved in that kind of popular culture, you are going to be involved in an adolescent mentality, an adolescent sensibility. And your idea of musical theater is going to be Andrew Lloyd Webber instead of George Gershwin or Rogerson Hart or Rogerson Hammerstein. And there's a discontinuity there that is not artistically helpful. So I'm living in a world in which I maintain my interest in those things that seem durable to me, the things that brought me into creative work in this music in the beginning. My consciousness has expanded and grown, of course, in many ways, but I've never abandoned the basic connection with the history of music that tells me that this element and that element and this other element and all of these elements have to be in there and in balance in order to make anything meaningful. And if you leave any of those elements out, you're not going to have a result that is going to be satisfying to me. If, like Philip Glass, you decide you're going to grind out some kind of hurdy-gurdy music, you may find some success for some period of time, but you can't convince me that music will stand up, for instance, next to Ellington's.
Yeah. It's a little harder to plumb the harmonic depths of Philip Glass than Duke Ellington or George Gershwin.
Yeah, well, it's hard to plumb the any depths.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And it's kind of wallpaper.
Yeah.
And there are some people who have been acculturated to accept kind of mental and emotional stasis as being of some kind of value to them. It feels like that kind of thing feels like it's holding me hostage, and it makes me terribly angry. Mm-hmm. When I used to, some years ago, when George Winston's New Age music was all the rage, and you would go into a restaurant and they would have this repeated triad mm-hmm. going on over and over and over in some piano music while you ate dinner, I'd go, first of all, I would ask them to stop it, and they never would. And then I would just say, I can't be here. I can't turn it off in my mind, and I can't think. You want to put on some music, you put on some Mozart or some Charlie Parker, it's fine. It at least moves my mind. Mm-hmm. It calls my attention sometimes, but it's a kind of attention that feels rewarding and makes me feel more human. This stuff makes me feel like a zombie. So anyway, there's lots of things going on in culture that need our attention, and I don't have answers to how to control that, or all I can control is my own musical world. That's why I haven't been a freelance bass player for years and years and years. Yeah, I don't want to be in a position where I'm playing music that is usually worse than meaningless to me. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that things have to be complicated. There's some wonderful, simple things. I think Ray Charles's music, nothing wrong with that, and it's not terribly complicated.
Folks have been raving about DAddario's Kaplan strings. I've been using them for the last year or so, and I really love them. And here's some feedback from people that recently won Kaplan strings in our DAddario giveaway.
Hi, Jason. This is Kim Perillo calling. So over the summer, I was one of the lucky winners of a new set of Kaplan strings. And now that I've had the strings on for several months, I wanted to share some thoughts. I opted for the heavy tension set, and I feel like the phrase heavy tension might sound a little scary, but they are easy to play on while still giving you that punchy sound when you need it. Overall, the trend for bass strings seems to be going brighter and brighter, and in that context, these strings are a little on the darker side, but they are not dull in the slightest. Still a great, crisp, clear sound. Thanks, Jason, and thank you, DAddario.
Learn more at contrabassconversations.com/strings, and thanks to DAddario for sponsoring the podcast. Good music is good music, but there's a lot of bad music out there.
There is a lot of it, and some of it gets a lot of attention.
Yeah.
I don't understand why Vijay Iyer is a MacArthur grantee. Mm-hmm. Makes no sense to me. I'm sorry to be critical of something that, and I don't mean really to single him out particularly, but he did get a MacArthur grant. And that's a remarkably misleading event. What does that have to do with swing, with harmonic development, with motivic development, with those things that brought me to this music in the first place? I can't find anything in there. Mm-hmm. The same holds true for Maria Schneider.
Yeah.
It's colorful, orchestrally colorful, but it has nothing to do with, she's supposed to be a Gil Evans disciple. Well, Gil Evans sort of turned left on himself. I used to live in the same building that he did, and I know what was going on. But that Maria Schneider's music has nothing to do with the things that Gil did with Miles. Anyway,
wow.
I'm kind of grumpy about all this stuff, but
no, it's good. It's good. Important things for people to think about, and good. There's good music and there's bad music, and understanding what makes one and one the other is important.
Yeah. Well, it has. What makes good music hasn't changed in hundreds and hundreds of years.
Right.
And no revolution is going to change that any more than it changes how human beings operate. Mm-hmm. Human beings are human beings, and we still revere Shakespeare for good reason.
Yeah, exactly. Shakespeare, Ellington, Gershwin, Mozart. There's
exactly
commonalities there for sure.
Right, and those same things are in some lighthearted music like Fats Waller's music. It's beautiful, wonderful, uplifting, spiritually stimulating music, and that's what brought me to jazz, and I live in that world, and I can't imagine anything that would pull me out of it.
There's another great post that you got that resonates with me, is the Department of Lesser Amplification. And it made me think of when I was in jazz band at Northwestern, spending 25 minutes checking every mic level of every single person and checking the amp and the bass amp and the guitar amp and all that. I enjoyed reading that, and just your thoughts on amplification and the effect it's had on jazz.
Well, we could talk for another 10 minutes about that, I'm sure. Microphones don't solve problems, they just change them.
Yeah.
And, well, I had some quotes in there. I think I talked about my friend Jerry Rosen, who was at one point the associate concertmaster of the Boston Symphony, saying that listening to music on records is like getting kissed over the telephone.
Yeah, I like that.
And then Bill Dobbin said, no, it's like eating a picture of food.
I like that.
So, I mean, these things are, I've been a hi-fi nut for 50 years at least, and sound reproduction is an interesting game for me. Mm-hmm. But it's never the same as being in the room with the music with no filters between you and either the machinery of the instrument or the human voice that's producing the music, with nothing between you and that but air. Listen, I heard Segovia play in Carnegie Hall, and I had a seat up in the nosebleed section. And there's this one classical guitarist in Carnegie Hall, and no microphone, no amplifier, and everybody heard every note he played. It's become also a kind of a political issue, because when you go into a club, I just played Thursday night at a club here that didn't require any amplification beyond perhaps a mic to make the announcements a little bit more intelligible. Mm-hmm. And everything was mic'd unnecessarily. And if you say, no, go home, we don't need this, you're putting a guy out of work. There's a guy whose business is providing that machinery. And you're looking at that guy, perfectly nice fellow, trying to do a good job. He's got a big investment in all that equipment. He's got to have these venues and these festivals and things that hire him all the time in order to keep up his business. And you say you don't need him, where his business goes away. It's tough.
Yeah, it is.
Fact is, I don't need him. I also don't need anybody. I got off the stand after the first set. We did 2 sets, and immediately, not 10 seconds went by, but in the club they put on canned music.
Oh, yeah.
Not bad music, but it's like going to a restaurant and you eat one course and then they serve you some canned food and then they give you another course of freshly prepared food. Doesn't make any sense at all. Well, anyway, it's the world we live in, and my effort is not to change that world because I can't. my effort is to understand it and negotiate my way through it in a way that is most rewarding and least damaging.
That canned music thing is so hard. I think there's a great Leonard Bernstein quote about that. He said, the problem with music today is that there's too much of it everywhere. Every moment of our lives is there's some background music of some sort. Any space we're in.
Yeah, he was absolutely right.
Yeah.
He was a smart guy.
Yeah, he definitely was. Well, I love the idea of just the instrument. Most of my playing is in the classical realm, and so I'm rarely thinking about an amplifier at all. I'm playing on a stage with an orchestra, and the only reason a mic might be there would be to capture a recording for archival purposes.
Yeah.
Then you get into these small jazz venues, even here in Chicago, these small venues, and everything's amplified to the max, and there's
terrifying to me.
Yeah,
terrifying.
It's true. Hey, maybe let folks know a little bit about your upcoming album. I think it's coming out in April, The Garden of Delights.
Okay. Well, okay. Then now I can talk like the movie star who just made a movie and get interviewed.
Exactly.
Now we can get to the point. Now that we've got all the rest of the stuff out. I moved to Portland. I retired from my teaching job in 2009. I've been here since then for about almost 6 years now, and I formed a band in order to play music that was under my control. Under my control to the extent that I write the script and I have these actors who perform the play. And I found a wonderful bunch of people who play very well and are devoted to the same aesthetic goals as I am. They didn't know they were devoted to those goals until we started working on this music, but they have become committed to them. As the rewards of playing this way have made themselves clear to them. We put out 2 CDs on our own, one which was a lot of material that I had developed from Bill Evans' material and some of mine, and then we did a Horace Silver record because when Horace died, I just thought, I owe this man so much in terms of my own musical background and growth, that I wanted to tip my hat to him and do a kind of reverential version of my perception of his music. And in hiring a publicity person to promote that album, that publicity guy said, you need to be connected with the guys at Time. These are people who understand how to market and promote music in this business environment as it exists now.
Yeah.
And we developed this relationship, and they seem to be strongly behind this recording. And I have to back off a little, kind of roll back the imaginary tape and say that my next project was going to be an album of Monk's music.
Oh, okay. Oh.
But the guys in the band said, we want to play your music. We do these pieces of yours mixed in with our program. We think there's enough variety. It is in some ways our identity. But let's make an album of your music. Well, I didn't decide that. They did. That was a kind of an encouraging experience for me, to have my own work supported that much by my colleagues. So we started to work on Garden of Delights, and the Time people, the people at the record company, were also very much in favor of that. They want my music. That's a risky decision for me, to the extent that I can't count on Ellington or Gershwin or Charlie Parker or Bud Powell or Bill Evans, or I have to produce my own material.
Yeah.
And I have to, from my own perspective, I have to compare it to the best things I know. So that's what's out there now. This is an example of the fullest expression of my musical life as I've been able to produce. And we will see how that affects listeners. It would be presumptuous of me to try to predict how that would go. I am, of course, deeply invested and curious to see if it has a salutary effect, if people like it, if people find it important and necessary. I think it has a great deal of variety, and that it has a good balance of those elements that are essential to me. And now we will see if those things are as effective in communicating with other people.
I'm looking forward to it. It must have been a lot of fun to leave the university job, move to Portland, get settled, focus on that project. That's great.
Oh, it was a big relief, and because I had. It's not that I didn't have moments during my teaching career that were rewarding. Of course I did, but there was a lot of frustration as well, and it was a relief not to have to deal with the institution.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Western Washington University was, by and large, a benevolent institution. I don't think it was an evil place at all. But it is a big institution, and it has its limitations because of that. And as soon as we were able to leave that and I could become my own man again, thanks to my wife's smart encouragement to put away money while we could, it was both a relief and it's good.
Yeah,
I'm not retired. I've just started my life again.
Yeah. Well, and what a great. I just love Portland. I've got family out there, and my brother went to University of Oregon, Eugene. Couldn't ask for a cooler city to be located in.
If you can't afford New York, and you can't afford, well, San Francisco has its own problems.
Yeah.
And so does Los Angeles. If you can't afford those places where there's really more going on, then this is a pretty good choice. And it was what we could afford, and we made the choice because of for all the reasons that people like it here, we like it too. The same reasons.
Right.
So I have some hope I'm cautiously hopeful about the Garden of Delights recording and the business relationship with the Dot-Time people. If it moves, if those guys do half of what they have promised to do in terms of promotion is kind of a funny word, but the whole effort to make this visible and bring it to the attention of people who might like it. If they do half of that, I think if they will do their half, I've done what I think is necessary, and then we will see if that works.
Thank you, Chuck, again, not only for this conversation a couple years back, but just hanging out and talking shop, and what a great time. We definitely have to do it again soon. And if you're looking, well, obviously, check out the links in the show notes for Chuck's website and what he's up to a lot. And if you are looking for more interviews with people in the jazz world, I've done many over the years, quite a few over the years, and I set up a special link so you can find just those. You go to contrabassconversations.com/jazz, and that will take you to my conversations with obviously Chuck, but also Ron Carter, Carlos Henriquez, Larry Grenadier. We have quite a list, and we're adding to that list all the time. If this is your first episode, welcome. We've got hundreds and hundreds. And again, go to the website. You can find those. Or you can download our app, contrabassconversations.com/app, or just search for us in your app store of choice. And you can then search by keyword, by topic, and get these delivered to you automatically. And, of course, Apple Podcasts and Stitcher and all the usual places. These podcasts are produced by Michael Cooper, Steve Hinchy, Trevor Jones, and Mitch Mooring. And if you're looking for a good new double bass, Mitch Mooring makes really nice bass. MitchMoring.com has more information. I am your host, Jason Heath, coming to you from San Francisco, California. I'm looking outside at the beautiful sunny day I'm about to go enjoy, and I feel so lucky to be able to bring you these episodes each and every week. Feel free to reach out at feedback@contrabassconversations.com and let me know any guest ideas, any topic ideas, or just to say hi. That would be great. And I love hearing from folks. I get messages each and every day, and I respond to every message I get. It might take me a few days, but I will get back to you. And that's how this show gets shaped. Pretty much every guest, every topic, every episode comes from you, the listener. So let me know what you'd like to hear. This is a community podcast, and I just have a blast doing this and hosting this. So thank you so much, and we will see you again soon for more life on the low end of the spectrum.